Thank you so much. It's a beautiful day outside. I'm so glad that you decided to come inside to join us. I wasn't sure if anybody was going to do that after the week that we had. It's just so nice to have a beautiful day that we can breathe the air. What we want to do is start by having our two panelists really introduce themselves and their work for just a few minutes before we have a conversation. And then at the end of our time together, we'll have an opportunity for you to ask some questions of them as well. All right? So, Bruni, why don't you start? Why don't you just give us a little bit of a sense of the work that you're doing and some of the things that you want to talk about today?
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here. My name is Bruni Pizarro. I am a partner and director of branding strategy for La Diaspora. I want to just quickly thank Arts and Ideas and shout out to Denise Santiesteban for our conversation that kind of materialized and evolved into this amazing conversation. So I'm really happy to be here with you all and the amazing, Jim, the amazing panelists that we have on stage. So I want to just take it kind of back to migration and thinking about my own personal story with migration, at least as it relates to my lineage of where my family came from. I'm Puerto Rican from New York City, AKA Diasporican, New Yorican, right? And Huepa. And my great-grandparents migrated from Puerto Rico in the 1940s with my father, and this is on my father's side, and my grandparents, right? And the reason why they migrated was because of Operation Bootstrap, which was very much pro-industrialization and displaced smallholder farmers, like my great-granddad, from his little town in Vega Baja, Puerto Rico, where he owned land. A lot of foreign interests, sugar companies, like Domino Sugar was this sort of hope and promise of jobs, and it was hope and promises that were not actualized, actually, in the end. Folks like my great-granddad moved to San Juan, and then eventually to New York City to live in substandard housing in Harlem, AKA El Barrio. That's kind of the lineage of migration, and in thinking about the ebbs and flows, right, which is the title of this amazing conversation. And I had to bring it back to my own personal experience. And so I'm going to be talking about more about migration in a different way with climate disaster, which is the disaster that my great-grandparents dealt with was, colonization, essentially, and what that means for its people, and hopes and promises, right? That's a disaster that's manufactured by humans. This is a different disaster that's also manufactured by humans in the global north, for the most part. So that's kind of a basis of my personal story. Is there another question that you may have?
I did know that you want to present a little bit of your work before we got started. Was there anything that you wanted to sort of line up for us, to let us know about, so that we get a basis for the work that you're doing right now?
Absolutely. So my work has focused since 2016 in 2017 on climate migration. My work has connected for the most part with Puerto Rican women who have migrated because of climate disaster in Puerto Rico. And that led me to a whole series of undertakings, including being the executive director of Junta for Progressive Action, which is the oldest Latinx social services organization in the greater New Haven area. Junta did a lot of work to be on the front lines and resettle families. I'll get more into that. And I want to just kind of talk about what climate migration is, what Puerto Rico is dealing with even this week with extreme weather, and an ethnographic vignette of a climate of someone who resettled from Puerto Rico that I worked with and I interviewed during my time in graduate school, who had firsthand experience with being displaced from Puerto Rico to New Haven, and what it's like for especially Puerto Rican women and single mothers to live in New Haven given the circumstances of being in this sort of being uprooted and being placed in a new foreign sort of land with different temperatures and weather and culture. And then what's next after that? What are possible ways of us kind of supporting these communities in the future? And kind of what my learnings are. 7 minutes to 10 minutes is not a long time. I wish I had more time to really delve into it, but I just kind of want to give you just a general overview.
Yeah, and we can get more into all of this as we talk. Well, Jim, how about you? Why don't you introduce yourself to our group and give us a little sense of the work that you're doing?
Yeah, thanks. My name is Jim O'Donnell. I'm a physical oceanographer, but not really. Doesn't mean much to most people. I use physics and mathematics, and I teach at UConn. I'm a professor of marine sciences. But I'm also a thing called the executive director of the Connecticut Institute for Resilience and Climate Adaptation. And so my work for the last decade or so has been to try and use physics and mathematics to project what's going to happen in Connecticut, and then organize people at UConn to try and help towns and citizens of Connecticut and the state agencies figure out what the options are for reducing the impacts of climate change here in Connecticut. But you know, so I'm not from around here either originally. You may have noticed. I'm an immigrant from Scotland 40 years ago. I've lived most of my adult life now in Connecticut, and I've been to most of the towns, and I've tried to help towns figure out what their options are. And I'm going to try and show you a little later two things. One thing is why small changes in things like mean sea level and mean atmospheric temperature create problems in Connecticut. And then I'll outline a few things that I've learned about what the challenges are and deciding what to do about those things.
Bruni, you just mentioned something, and when we sat down, I was talking about how today's a day when you can breathe the air where we are in Connecticut after days of wildfire smoke coming from our friends to the north in Canada. It was happening because of climate change. It was happening because a much earlier fire season than usually happens up there. It happened because of an unusual weather pattern caused by the jet stream, which was sort of sticking in a very specific location, spinning the smoke down. But in Puerto Rico, something different was happening with this jet stream over the course of the last week or so, and you made reference to it. A very serious weather event with incredibly high temperatures, much higher temperatures than people are used to. And this is the sort of climate impact that you're seeing more and more for people on the island.
Well, thank you for that, for raising that issue. While we were here inhaling this sort of smoke from Canada because of the wildfires due to, for the most part, climate change-induced disaster in its own right, Puerto Ricans had experienced a 125 degree heat index in the archipelago. So I was seeing on Instagram, people were frying up eggs, literally frying up eggs to make their meals outside. And that's not even being figurative or symbolic. That is how hot it was. You can fry an egg. That said, it's important to elevate the fact that 40,000 people there, while this was happening, 125 degree heat index in Puerto Rico, while this was happening, at least 40,000 people were left without electricity because of the poor infrastructure that has not been rebuilt after Hurricanes Maria, or properly rebuilt. What they did was a patch-up job, basically. And so now we're dealing with the deleterious impacts of climate change. We know that this archipelago, that Puerto Rico, has been hit over and over again, and yet the infrastructure is dwindling and hasn't been a priority for the Puerto Rican government. And to a certain degree, the US government, because we have to remember that Puerto Rico is an unincorporated territory possession of the United States of America since 1898. Well, since 1898 is when we became a possession, but in 1917 we became citizens of the United States, and for many we have been treated like second-class citizens, and this is just an example of such acts. So time is now to make these changes and create infrastructural changes in places like Puerto Rico, so that then disaster resettlement can be mitigated appropriately.
Yeah, and when you talk about infrastructure changes, maybe you can take us back to the time before Hurricane Maria, because that was obviously not the first major event to happen in Puerto Rico. It was certainly not the first major climate change related event, but it did change so much about the migration patterns. Maybe you can take us back to just before that time and what exactly then happened with so many people migrating full time then to the United States, including places like Connecticut.
Well, in the case of Puerto Rico, which has been my focus of
Yeah.
my work for the most part, there were, so because of the tenuous relationship between the U.S. and Puerto Rico, and that Puerto Rico is a commonwealth or unincorporated territory, there is, basically Puerto Rico almost went bankrupt essentially. So then there were austerity cuts because it was a government body of a group of people that were appointed by Puerto Rico called La Junta, and through the Promesa Act, created austerity measures in Puerto Rico, which was a disaster before the actual disaster of Hurricanes Maria and Irma. So that touched down a couple years before, or was in process before 2017, during when these hurricanes touched down. By then, the infrastructure was already broken. Essentially, schools were already closing down, hospitals were, there were budget cuts with hospitals. Hospitals didn't have the adequate resources needed to help people with dialysis and other things and operations. And it's just like austerity cuts left and right. So the social infrastructure, the protections that are needed for communities in Puerto Rico to thrive were not there. It's just been dwindling. So that is the perfect storm that predates any kind of climate change-induced disaster, because it's already in a vulnerable and weakened position. And so this was by design.
So making a parallel then, Jim, as we talk about how Connecticut is prepared for major disasters. So we have migration, which we'll get more into, people needing to come to a place that's relatively safe from hurricanes, place that's relatively speaking welcoming to migrants from elsewhere compared to other parts of these United States. What is the status of Connecticut's infrastructure to respond and be resilient to storms like the one that hit Puerto Rico?
I guess Connecticut is a much wealthier state, and we have invested in planning processes, and there's a coordinator for several different regions. Well, each Connecticut split into regions for emergency management, and each region has a coordinator, and these coordinators meet with each other on a regular basis, and there's a state agency, a committee that helps coordinate them, and they coordinate also with NGOs and charities. And the mechanism for the response to a major disaster then is to evacuate the places along, where flooding are likely. That's the main target of our planning right now, is coastal flooding during a hurricane. So the idea is to evacuate the areas at risk and then provide services through these emergency management organizations to people who are in need. And there are limited plans, I think, for restoration of the infrastructure after the disasters. And 10 years ago, after there was 10 to 12 years ago, there was 3 major weather events: a big snow event early in the year, shut down power in much of Connecticut, and then there was 2 a tropical storm, actually, and then a superstorm Sandy. They caused widespread power outages across Connecticut, and that was a wake-up call, I think, for the state legislature. And that's what led to me having the job I have today at UConn as executive director of CIRCA. So since then, we've tried to educate people about what the vulnerabilities are, but there hasn't been a lot of action occurring, though. There's been, in the last 2 years, the last 2 legislative sessions, there's been some new changes to policy and law that are forward-looking. But there are fundamental gaps in resilience in the face of these events. Costs money, as you find in Puerto Rico, right? If you don't invest in a resilient infrastructure, then you're going to pay a cost down the road. I think in Connecticut we have the option of investing in that because it's a wealthy state, as do other states. Like in Texas, there was a well-known sort of power disaster a few years ago where their power grid was overloaded and it went down for quite a few days, and there was extreme heat events that caused it. And that was clearly because they tried to minimize the investment in the infrastructure to deliver power to people. So Connecticut's not as bad as that, but we have to maintain the capacity to react to these events because they're inevitable. And I'll talk more about how predictable the change in these major events is.
Quickly, just talk about what those gaps are. Give us an example in Connecticut of some of the gaps, whether it's in funding or actual building infrastructure. Where do they exist right now?
Well, I think that let me point to things that are positive first, right? The building codes in Connecticut have lagged national standards for a long time, and over the last few years they've come up to higher standards. So now new houses have to be built with much more robust roofs, and windows. So because one of the major effects of hurricanes is to blow the roofs off the houses, and then their interior is vulnerable to rain. Right? So and that mechanism can be resisted by better building standards. But we have about roughly a million houses in Connecticut, and we build about 3,000 a year. Right? Now, I might be off by a factor of 20% in those two numbers, but it's roughly that. So that means if we rely on building new houses to recapitalize or make our housing more resilient, it's going to take hundreds of years, right? Because we only build 3,000 and we've got a million, right? So that process, how do we incentivize people and encourage them to be more resilient is a serious problem, and we haven't really moved the needle on that adequately. And it's linked, though, to the other problem at climate change, which is to reduce our reliance on CO2 emissions and emissions of other greenhouse gases. And I think there's movement in the state now to try and accelerate the deployment of distributed solar generation. The Green Bank has done a great job at that. But there also needs to be upgrading of all the heating and cooling and insulation and infrastructure in the million homes in Connecticut. And if we don't start that soon, right, 10 years from now we'll be in the same place because it's a big effort.
Mm-hmm. So let's loop back to the aftermath of Hurricane Maria and talk more about some of the work that you did while you were at Junta, Bruni. Thousands of Puerto Ricans displaced from their homes end up coming to Connecticut. How was our state responding? How did we do at being able to essentially absorb these thousands of folks into our midst, into our state?
So in 2017, 2018, approximately 13,000 Puerto Ricans migrated temporarily or permanently to Connecticut, to the state, 13,000. And of those 13,500, Junta supported 2,000 and saw and served 2,000 individuals. I was there as a student in 2017, 2018, not as an employee and not as the executive director. My stomping grounds were at Junta, and also Fairhaven Resource Center across the street. Give them a shout out as well. But I really was able to observe all the amazing work Junta was able to do to resettle these families. But most importantly, I want to emphasize that is the cultural proximity to the communities that Junta serves, to the newcomers, to new arrivals, to people that were coming here from distant lands, that were uprooted, that had mental health trauma because they were uprooted, and also they had other things in their lives in the archipelago, other problems, other things that they were dealing with before the hurricane. So having all these cumulative burdens and having someone to say hello and like have a welcome party, basically, essentially, right? Does so much. It's that human experience that is so, so important in climate migration. And yes, this is migration. The conversation here is about migration, but I also want to augment the point that this is also forced displacement. So folks are on the move, right? But not because they want to. So it's a little different from how my great-grandparents came, and it's not like my great-grandparents really wanted to come to the stateside, but at least they had the agency in some respects, to a certain degree, right? I'm qualifying that, of course, to say, hey, we're going to pack our bags, there's time, we're going to move. From one day to the next, I mean, I was teaching a class, an English class, like volunteering to teach an English class in Fairhaven, the Fairhaven Resource Center, and I started seeing migrants, climate migrants, these wonderful families come to my class to learn English. And I was like, so where's everyone from, blah, 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 right? And this is what I was doing in grad school, like just to get acquainted with the community. And I had climate migrants in my class, wonderful mothers, people that were living in FEMA hotels. And I was like, what? I read about it in the news. I can't believe y'all are here. Like, it literally, I just was like shocked. And so I did my whole thesis research, my master's research on this very topic. And unfortunately, at the time, the School of the Environment, back then it was called the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, I had advisors that didn't really believe that climate migration was a thing and that people, like that this was a climate change issue.
What do you mean? They didn't believe it was a thing
I
that
don't
like
know.
people had to...
I was questioned about is it urban enough? Is it really climate change? And I still went for it and was able to get advisors that were able to support me in other schools on campus, like sociology, American studies. And I was able to do what I had to do to get this work done, and I'm still presenting on it now. Because you know why? Because this is the stories. What I did was I wanted to capture what was going to be the historic, because in the embodiment of disaster, what these women that I interviewed went through is something that has to be affirmed. Because at the end of the day, if it's not affirmed, and I don't know if I'm the one to do it necessarily and translate, you always get something lost in translation. I'm a New Yorican, I'm not from the archipelago. Those jokes that they had, I was like, I don't know, I couldn't translate that because, you know, it's just, there's things that you lose. So that's my subjectivity coming into this. But at least I was able to be there to capture, to be with the women, to see how they mother, to talk to them, to see how they theorize on an everyday basis, that there's beauty in struggle, right? And that they're surviving and trying to thrive, and what their rationale is for why they're doing what they're doing, and why did they decide to leave Puerto Rico. It's so historical, it's so place-based, and it's so human. And I'm so proud that I was able to just be like, you know what, cut the noise. I don't care what the academy really says at this point. At the end of the day, it's about the people, and this is a real topic, and no longer is it not going to be discussed.
Well, I mean, tell me, I don't know if you can tell me some of their stories, but I mean, what did you hear from these women?
I have like an ethnographic vignette, if y'all want to hear it. There's like an excerpt from my thesis. It's quick. I know I don't have much time, but this is...
Take your time, yeah.
One woman, mother, who was amazing, and I spent time with her in the hotel. Remember that there was sort of the context behind this is folks came to New Haven specifically that I worked with, who usually came because they had a loved one or a social network here, right? But sometimes that became precarious because landlords were like, hey, families, lease, the person on the lease, you're gonna have to, you know, at some point you may be evicted because you have this extra person on that's living with you that's not on the lease. So it kind of became this sort of ripple effect for folks in the diaspora that were trying to support these new arrivals. Those are the ones, that's the backbone. Really? You know how much money this country has saved? Because the idea of who's really frontline, of course, it's social services organizations like Junta, but it's the families, it's the loved ones, it's the neighbors, it's the ones who gave a hand and said, you know what, you're being uprooted, come on over here, spend some time with us. But that creates precarity for those that live here. So when you start seeing the ecosystems, this is all about ecosystems, right? there and here, it's important to really take all of that into consideration, and that's what my work did. So some of the amazing mothers that I spoke to were living in temporary sheltering assistance, FEMA subsidized housing, which was so, so important. And I just want to give a shout out to Karen DuBois-Walton from Elm City Communities, who really was so supportive in this work to make sure that the climate migrants that we worked with at Junta were able to get adequate shelter. And so that's really important. A lot of agencies came together, like Elm City Community, the City of New Haven through Rick Fontana, Emergency Services, other nonprofits, Iris, Junta, and they met every week to sort of triage or connect the dots and make sure that the gaps are being taken care of. And so because New Haven has a wonderful scale to be able to do this work versus like New York, I think is a little more daunting because it's larger, they were able to connect and triage services. And Junta, and I went to some of those meetings as a student and was able to see the work in action. And these were bonds that were here amongst communities, those that did community, that worked in community-based organizations and governments. Those bonds that have been around for years, that have been strengthened for years, now really came into play. So those are interesting social networks, even amongst service providers, right? And then when I was able to follow these women in the FEMA hotel housing, I was able to see them, how they lived. They didn't have a kitchen. They had an electric stove. They had a small little refrigerator for 4 children and themselves. It was crowded. The children were playing in the hotel room. They were thankful. They were so thankful that they had a roof over their head, that they didn't have to be in a shelter, to be honest. Like, that's not what they was not idealized, that they had their own place, but they were dreaming, but also waiting. And so Yarimar Bonilla, who's an anthropologist and right now is the director of Centro for Puerto Rican Studies, I follow her work. She's amazing, also a Puerto Rican scholar. And she talks about this as, quote unquote, the weight of disaster. They waited for the government in Puerto Rico to support them, to provide aid to them, and they kept waiting and waiting. Years later, still nothing. The same thing happened here. Even though they crossed the Atlantic Ocean, they still waited. And it's now, though, it's been transformed into the embodiment of disaster while they still wait. And constantly, every 2 months, every 3 months, they were told that FEMA wasn't going to pay for an extension of their hotel, and they didn't have any other place to go. So these are the things that folks were talking about, and it was very complex. And so one of the women that I spoke to was talking about waiting for daylight to come in Puerto Rico. Before she came here, she was talking about like what that wait looked like in terms of day and night. Like how day was like, she always wanted to, like she couldn't wait until daylight broke the next day, until dawn came. And this is translated from Spanish, but I'll just read a quick excerpt. She said, during the day, fine, it's the day. You do not need electricity because there's daylight, because you can do things even though you're affected a lot by the lack of electricity. At 6 p.m., you begin to prepare mentally, because that is what it is to prepare mentally for the darkness to come. To wait until dawn at 6 a.m. in the middle of the silence of darkness because you do not hear anything. What you hear are coquis. You hear the noises you never heard when you had light. When you had light, you slept fine with your fan on and did not hear anything. But then, in the middle of the night, you hear the 20 noises you never heard when you had light. I thought that was so poetic.
My goodness.
And beautiful and tragic and just, so that's what that is. That is the human moment. Just give me chills. But yeah, that's just one of many excerpts. And this is all going to be published. We're working on a paper with 2 of my distinguished, amazing colleagues, abogadas, Professor Camila Bustos and Tabitha Subdeo, who works at, she's the Director of Community Outreach, I believe, at IRIS. And so we're going to come together on a trifecta
My goodness,
article.
what a chilling story.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. But before Jim, because I would like to have you present some of your work as well, as I know you brought some things to show us. I'm wondering if you could just react to that. For the people like you who do work around climate change, climate resilience, what happens when everything is taken away because of terrible storms? How do you react to that story?
Well, I have two reactions. Well, the first one is it's easy for people who are at a policy level to develop ideas and that we think are good for people and strategies for dealing with problems. And I've mostly been working in these issues at that level. But when you enter a conversation in which you actually have to talk to someone who's dealing with it, and your examples are a classic, beautiful case of the impacts of storms and the need for support for people who are impacted, right? It's quite different. And similarly, I had a reaction like this recently too when I was talking to a person who owns a home in an area which is frequently flooded, and from a policy perspective, it's easier to say, well, you shouldn't be there, right? That you have to either spend money to change this and make the building bigger or higher or further back, right? Or move somewhere else. Right? But when you realize that that person is emotionally attached to it, even though in terms of United States spectrum of wealth, most people who live in the shoreline in Connecticut are on the upper end of that spectrum, right? They're fairly affluent, but they're connected to the location because of the history of their parents and their grandparents often, and their children grew up there, and their grandchildren they hope to come and visit. They're emotionally attached to it. It's not just like an economic thing. However, appreciating how difficult it is for people to take the steps is important to policymakers. And so I really noted the need to communicate those stories, and for people who are at policy level to be in touch with people who are impacted directly in order to make much more effective strategic decisions. Because if you don't appreciate how it's affecting people, the even smart policies won't get enacted. There won't be support for it, and you end up not changing anything.
And that's one of the reasons, yes, things don't get changed. We were talking about this just before this talk began, that often the people who are making these policy changes, making policy decisions, are trying to do so with the hard, cold facts of science. And the fact is that climate change has been coming for us for quite some time. There's a very good case that we should be retreating from certain places. There's a very good case that we shouldn't be living certain places in the world anymore if we can help it. But the fact is, Jim, that's home for people. And so you need to use stories like Bruni's actually to be able to change people's minds and get them to do something about it policy-wise.
Yeah, that was exactly my point. Thanks. The second point, though, is that it's foreseeable that events like the migration that occurred after Maria in Puerto Rico are going to occur again. And that's how I think climate change is going to affect people. It's not like all of a sudden everybody in equatorial zones around the world are going to die. Right? People are the frequency at which they suffer dislocations in their agriculture or their power system or their flooding, right, is going to increase, and that's going to push migration. And there's going to be mass migration from areas which are vulnerable, low-lying areas around the equatorial zone first. And so even though Connecticut is not going to be impacted as badly as other parts of the United States, and certainly not as badly as other parts of the world, and also because we have some resources and we've got people helping us plan what to do, we can mitigate those impacts. There is inevitably going to be mass migrations, and there's going to be ripple effects on the economy and our society as a consequence of that. Just like there's a good case to be made that the fires in Canada right now have a basis in the higher temperatures and lower humidities up there, right? And Connecticut is impacted by that. New York is impacted by that. And there's nothing that we can do about it ourselves, because except help some firefighters are going to try and help Canada control those burns. But we're going to be impacted by things that occur in other parts of the world directly through air movement and indirectly through people movement eventually. And it's not unpredictable. It's very, very likely.
Speaking of people movement, I mean, one of the things that I know that you work on is trying to make sure that the state has a comprehensive plan for dealing with these disasters, something that I used to talk about on my radio show a lot. It was something that was always remarkable to me, was that the way that Connecticut is run with 169 towns and cities, each one of them would come up with a disaster plan, a plan for what to do when the hurricane comes. And if you can imagine having 169 different town managers or mayors, first selectmen, coming up with different plans, Jim, and literally pointing people in different directions in order to escape from a hurricane, that's the sort of thing that I know that you, other policy folks, have been trying to work on, but it's not easy in a place like this where we're all so connected, but yet we have 169 different governments.
Yeah, so if it was easy, people would have done it probably, right? But I think the political structure in Connecticut does make things more difficult, and also the sort of political traditions of the United States. There's a strong tradition about ownership of private property, independence of action, and freedom is wound into those two things. In other countries, especially in Europe and in the UK, it's not in Europe anymore, I understand. But,
used to be.
Yeah, it used to be, yeah. But there's a little more tolerance for government policies that affect people's private property. And there are places in the UK I know of where towns have closed roads and moved houses through what we would call eminent domain in this country. And it's not easy, but I think it's much harder here. And then the political fractures that have evolved over the last 100 years, which divide towns along boundaries that made sense in the 17th century, right? They don't make sense when it comes to planning for climate change. So because oftentimes rivers, like the Mystic River, runs through Groton and Stonington. It's the boundary of those two towns, and it has been for hundreds of years, right? But if you want to reduce flooding associated with sea level rise around the Mystic River, you've got to have Stonington and Groton cooperate on developing the thing that otherwise it's not going to work. And I didn't want to pick on Stonington and Groton. I just happen to live there, right? But these boundaries are like that everywhere else in Connecticut. And then there's a north-south divide that has occurred between like Bridgeport and Orange and New Haven, and I've forgotten what town's next north of that. But these boundaries were established in some cases because of where churches were built. You know, that people had to go to church every Sunday, and when a new church was built, a new town was formed, more or less, right? But what that means is that, and then taxes are focused on towns' property. So for Bridgeport to increase its tax revenue in order to pay for services, it has to have more development. More development in an area which is less flood-prone, north of 95, might be a sensible thing from a policy perspective and from a state as a whole perspective. But it doesn't help the town of Bridgeport, or the city of Bridgeport, generate tax revenue to provide the services for the people who live there already. So these structures that are local make it difficult for sensible adaptation and resilience planning. And that's one of the things that CIRCA, the organization I run, has tried to help with. we can't force people to participate, but we try and coordinate towns and agencies to take regional approaches to these problems.
You said earlier, Bruni, just how much the government of Puerto Rico let the people there down, and these are the things that were being directly reported to you. So fixing government structures, like Jim was just talking about, that's something that's very, very needed. Have you seen any positive steps, whether it's in infrastructure or in the political system, the political will there, that might make it easier for people the next time something like that happens there?
My focus is on the diaspora, vis-a-vis stateside. So with the happenings in Puerto Rico are more of me reading peripherally and connecting with folks who have been seeing that on the ground. My on the ground is here, so I don't want to, speak for them.
Yeah.
But from what I've seen and my connections to people in the archipelago, there's a lot of amazing ingenuity, collaboration amongst the communities. They're not relying anymore on the governments to help them. That was, again, a dream not actualized. The ebbs and flows are moving in the direction of a wave of the community standing up for themselves and saying, what do you get at? Are you an architect? Or you're a carpenter? Or you're a good cook, you're a great chef. You cook some really good rice and beans. That's going to fuel us. That is, the people power movements are surging there. And I think there's such beauty, and the arts are working with community members, making sure that the most vulnerable there, older adults, children, are sought after. They're just, sometimes I think that's the silver lining in all of this. You have to kind of go through things. Now you know your neighbor more. You built a house for them. Like, that's the beauty. And that's the level of imagination that's necessary in climate communications. That's where my work is now. I've, since leaving Junta, I joined forces with my husband, Daniel, who's taking pictures now. Thank you. Is working on looking at bilingual, bicultural design and media, and just really looking at all those worlds, thinking about what the nonprofit sector does, these social services that are frontline, really thinking about the lived experience, the nuance associated with the Latinx community, because we're not all the same. Some of us speak Spanish, some of us only speak English, even though we're Latinx, and some of us speak Spanglish or native languages, right? And some of us have status, some of us don't have status, some of us are black, some of us are biracial, some of us are multiracial, some of us are, light skin presenting and racially ambiguous, some of us are not. Like, we are so complex, right? There's not a binary here. I have cousins that are like darker than me, lighter than me, redheads. I'm just like, wow, what did this amazing remezcla or mixture of people, and they come with their own unique particularities, right? So how do we create climate communications that is, and this is what we're doing in our design studio, that is for the people, by the people, for us, by us, that really speaks to thinking about the needs and the concerns of the communities. That is the next level. How do we take those stories, elevate those stories, and then how do we collaborate with these communities to think about a new future in the climate era?
What are some specific needs in the climate era, a climate arena that you see right now?
There's a ton of need. Like at Junta specifically, the people that we worked with, we're dealing with this is the Latinx community is the fastest growing demographic in the United States. We are the largest demographic in New Haven. Yet, I don't understand why there's not access to linguistic access to resources. Why the majority of our community members that were coming to Junta when I was there just a few months ago were still coming with a paper saying, can you please translate? That was happening 40 years ago. That was happening 30 years ago. Remember, Junta's been around since 1969. There should be no reason why in this era, things with Google Translate, at least, bare minimum, although that's not enough, That is not enough. That is the first step, is translating something linguistically. The second step is looking at visuals, because it's not a cookie-cutter approach to communications. It's not a cookie-cutter approach to strategy. A lot of it is strategy. How do we strategize with the community? How do we connect? How do we, that's the biggest gap I see. That is where my subjectivities come into the play. And then, of course, I have an amazing visual artist who is my husband, so there's that. But how do we join forces with our own lived experience to start thinking about that gap that exists? And the gap is communication gap between policymakers, stakeholders, and just like the communities that we're serving that are dealing with cumulative burdens like food apartheid, being wage theft, discrimination. There's interpersonal violence. There's mental health, negative mental health outcomes. There's chronic conditions like asthma because they live in environmental justice areas, right? Redlined areas, disinvested areas. Historically, that takes a toll and creates, in the cities, urban trauma, right? I am a product, a legacy of my parents, especially my father, who dealt with urban trauma when he came to Harlem years ago and had to deal with racial wars. So just that adjustment of being othered, but having the opportunity to have communications and people that welcome you, whether it's a flyer or it's not have to be a flyer, but it could be a source of a public health thing, product, or a book, or a video, or something that speaks to the communities, that you collaborate with them, and then bring that back to policy makers. Bring that back to, connect these worlds together. Much like I love what Circa does. You have a wonderful multi-layered approach, very intersectional group of people from just various disciplines that work together to solve problems. That is the way to do it. So.
And thank you for that. And in just a couple of minutes, I want to get to some questions that you may have for our panelists. Jim, I know that you wanted to present a little bit more of some of the work that you do. Maybe show us some stuff about how Connecticut does in terms of climate resilience and climate impacts here.
Yeah, thanks. I have a couple of slides to illustrate. I've got sort of two major points I want to make. Here's some pictures from around my neighborhood, the eastern part of Connecticut, that were taken in the last year. And the top left there is a road along the Mystic River, and that's occurred. Flooding like that occurs along that. There's a road under there, actually. You can't see it, but there's a road that goes to a little marina in Mystic. And it floods like that maybe several times a year already. And then the one that is center at the top is Gravel Street in Mystic. If you go up that road and look across the river, you see Mystic Seaport. And if you go towards me from this picture, or out of the picture, you get downtown where you get ice cream and T-shirts, and you see the bridge and stuff. And then the Brantford one, and centered at the bottom, is a good example of an event which occurred multiple times a year now too, where the road goes underneath. It's Route 146. It goes underneath the train line from New York to Boston, and that road floods multiple times a year currently. And finally, the one on the bottom right is again, it's Route 146 in Guilford, and that's an ambulance driving along the road. These things occur currently, maybe like several times a year now. 100 years ago, they probably didn't, right? And so they're not catastrophic storms. They're not hurricanes that are going to kill hundreds of people and knock down power lines for months, right? Connecticut is vulnerable to those. In 1938, in eastern Connecticut, there was a hurricane, and it apparently knocked down about 40-50% of the trees in Connecticut as a whole. The storm surge level was, in some places, was estimated to be 17 feet in eastern Connecticut. People died all across the region, and houses were destroyed. In some areas, there's a park in Groton called Bluff Point State Park. And Bluff Point had cottages on it, in 1938, and the cottages were all destroyed, and they weren't allowed to be rebuilt. That's why it's a state park now, and you can walk out and see the foundations of those buildings. So this is an example of a sort of a retreat, and it was done because the guy who owned the property just said, this is not going to be allowed anymore. All the other promontories at Groton Long Point and some other places around eastern Connecticut, development got densified, right? So these are two different kinds of problems. I want to emphasize that. The hurricanes occur roughly once every 10 years in Connecticut. A really bad one has occurred once in 100 years. And the probability of those occurring in the future is increased a little bit. But even if they were the same, they'd be devastating anyway, right? And our strategy for dealing with that is simply to try and, currently the strategy is to try and limit development in the areas that would be flooded, and then to evacuate people who live in those areas to higher ground and then allow them to come back after the storm and rebuild, right? That's the strategy. The strategy for dealing with these kinds of problems, which are the more frequent floods, are really a thing that we can deal with in Connecticut ourselves. We could raise some roads, etc. These roads could be raised, or maybe we could move the facilities, and those are tractable things that are in something in the power of towns in Connecticut to do. Show me the next one, please. So let me show you why a small change in mean sea level will result in much more frequent occurrence of these events. Right, the top figure shows, the graph shows in green the water level at New London, and the picture on the top right is a New London tide gauge. That's a water level measurement. Now maybe it should be clear here, the tide is an oscillation in the water level that's driven by astronomical cycles. So the Earth rotates around its axis, the Moon rotates around the Earth, and they both rotate around the Sun. And the gravitational fields associated with those cycles cause a predictable oscillation in the velocity in the water level. And the blue line in the top is what is due to the tide. That's a predicted part, and you can predict it out for the next 50 years if you want, very precisely. And we do that because it's important for navigation, right? The green is what actually occurred. The green is the observed water level, and it's composed of the tidal part, the blue part, plus the atmospherically forced part, the weather part. And they're different. And the big green peak on the left there is a storm that occurred just before Christmas last year. And it led to flooding of the type that I showed you in the first picture. Now, the second figure below that, the blue line, is the difference between the blue and the green. That is a part of the water level fluctuation that's due to the weather. And I drew a line along there at 4 feet elevation, and to show that if you were at that level, you'd expect it to be flooded maybe 5 times in the last 100 years, because that data record's been collected since about 1938. So it's almost 100 years long, and during that time, that water level has been exceeded 5 times. Now, if the mean sea level had just been 20 inches higher, 20 inches is only about up to my knee, right? Right. The change in the frequency of the water getting to that height can be calculated by just replotting the graph. So let's see the next one. So now you can see how many times that water level has been exceeded. With a 20-inch increase in sea level, we went from being flooded 5 times in 100 years to 48 times in 100 years. Right? So it's a 10-fold factor in the increasing risk of being flooded. So that's how a small change in the mean value can affect in a big way the risk of these extreme events, right? And so, and it's predictable. The question is, how much will mean sea level increase in the next 20, 30, 40, 100 years? Because if we knew that, then we could predict pretty accurately how much more frequently we should expect to be flooded. And consequently, how high we'd need to raise the roads or the houses to avoid being flooded in the future, right? So this data has got 2 values. One is to calculate what the risk is so you can get a fair price on your insurance or estimate what your repair costs are going to be. And also to figure out how to make your infrastructure different so that you aren't flooded. Let's go to the next one. So here's, in the wiggles there are the data that's been observed since 1938 of the annual mean sea level. And you can see in like 38 it was about minus 0.2 meters, And then now it's about 0.1 meter. And so roughly, in the 35 years I've been in the United States, this graph suggests that we've increased our sea level by about 0.1 meters. And if you just draw the black line there, it goes up to 1.5 on the right side. That's a projection of what you would get if you just drew a line through the data, right? And that would be assuming that things stay the same. It just continues to increase at the same rate. And the data, there are several colors in that wiggled line there, and those are from a variety of tide gauges on Long Island Sound that I put together, right? And they're all in agreement. They're all going up. Now the question is, what's going to happen in the future? Let's go to the next one. This is the last one. There are several ways to estimate what the mean sea level is how it's going to increase. And I got charged a few years ago by the legislature to estimate them for Connecticut, right? And this is what I came up with. The purple line at the top is the worst possible case that is physically plausible. Right? So if you look at how rapidly ice is melting and how rapidly the ocean's warming, and you extrapolated the biggest rates of warming and the biggest rates of melting, that's what you would get. It could be up to 2 meters by 2100 or nearly 7 feet. If you take the data and that is the upper bound of what I showed, the extrapolation of the data, you get the blue line at the bottom, right? And so what you see at 2100 is a big difference. But at 2050, you see these lines are not that much different, right? The explosion and the difference really occurs because we don't really know what happens. It's hard to project further out than it is easier, right? So I could probably hit this screen with a basketball if I threw it, but it's very unlikely I could hit the projector with a basketball, right? So it's easier to predict closer than it is further, and that's why these things diverge. So the recommendation that Connecticut adopted is that we should plan for 50 centimeters or 20 inches as the upper bound of what's likely by 2050. And that's got the great property that it's a sort of a sensible thing to plan for in the short term. But if you look at the blue line, it's also it's the lowest that we should expect by 2100. So if we plan for 50 centimeters or 20 inches by 2050, that's like a forward-looking conservative estimate. It's also the least you should do by 2100. So in Connecticut, our policy now is to require towns to use that 20 inches in planning for all the new infrastructure along the shoreline, and to reanalyze the data and reanalyze science every 10 years to project whether or not we're on track. And that's like I thought a major thing that Connecticut has done that's forward-looking.
Just very, very quickly, Bruni, do you have a reaction to all that?
I think this is really important information. Thank you so much, Jim, for breaking that down. I think it's important for us to be forward-thinking and prepare, homeowners alike, homeowners, neighborhoods, communities, states, cities, all the things. So thank you for helping us think about this, especially if we live by the shoreline.
Yeah. We have time maybe for one question from the audience, and I know we're up against 2 o'clock. Does anybody have a question for our panelists? Yes, sir.
That is a very complex question.
Yeah, and you have 1 minute to answer.
Yeah, I
Yes.
probably will leave that to another day if possible. But thank you for the question.
Yeah.
That's it's a complex question, and I think that the people there will need to decide what their destiny will be. But it's going to take a different shape, form, and I think that the people there are doing what they have to do to connect the dots for themselves, and I think that's the most important part. Because you could still be a sovereign state and still be controlled and oppressed, right? So, or sovereign nation, right? So I think that that's a whole PhD dissertation / other topic of conversation, but I appreciate the question.
But maybe there's a way to wrap this up, because I think something Jim said, let's just take a look at Texas. We know they're a state, and they didn't do such a great job with some of this planning themselves, right? It's being a United State doesn't necessarily mean anything when it comes to the types of planning that we have to do here.
Yeah, and
that they would get support from the federal government at a better level. That's really my idea.
right, but FEMA wasn't there for Katrina,
So
really, and so in Louisiana, and we
Yeah.
saw that was a lot of it dealt with racism, but also inadequate measures to deal with that issue with Katrina. That was like one of the largest catastrophes in this nation. Also, we look culturally at Hawaii, and not from a climate change perspective,
Sure.
but from a cultural cleansing perspective, if you will, linguistic cleansing perspective. They're also being displaced as we speak.
Yeah.
Because
Jim, yeah.
I just wanted to point out that it was touch and go whether the Northeast got federal disaster relief after Superstorm Sandy. And many of the states that are often impacted by hurricanes voted against that appropriation. So
Yeah.
being a state is not by itself panacea. Having good government is I think the real answer.
100%. I
Yeah.
agree.
Well, I think that's a panel discussion for another day, and probably a really good one to have. Bruni and Jim, thank you so much for all of the work that you do and for bringing this to us today. And thank you for coming out today, folks. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone.